All right. Hey, everyone. Some people are getting into the meeting right now, but my name's John. I am our GM of payments here at Maxio, and I'm excited to spend, roughly the next 30, 45 minutes with you, depending on how engaging this audience is and how many questions I can answer for you as we go throughout our presentation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to dive right into it. So the main purpose of today's session is to talk about some basic things that many of you run into in your daily lives running businesses. Your customer pays, and at the end of the day, you're just trying to figure out where's the money in your bank account. And surprisingly, that can be more complex than it needs to be or it should be. And a little bit about myself. Before I came to Maxio, I was actually a controller at a rapidly growing SaaS business. And so many of the problems that we talk about today or in some of the processes are things that I've lived through personally. One of the fun things about the role I have here at Maxio today is I get to work with teams to design solutions to all those old problems I had. And some of you may be dialing in and you're learning a little bit more about Maxio, and you may be going, why are we talking so much about payments today? Payments is one of the things that Maxio has invested in heavily over the past few years. And when you think about Maxio is really known for like billing, revenue, and then you're reporting on top of that, whether it be SaaS metrics, revenue metrics, billing metrics, et cetera. Payments in your workflow with payments is inherently linked to all of those things on billing. So we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail today. And there are really four things that we're going to talk about today. One is the black hole that can be payments, and how complex it can get. And then we're going to get into a few other topics, like if you have failed payments, can that impact could that lead to a failed business? The cost of disconnected processes, and then ultimately what we think is a solution to some of those pain points today. Like Aldine said in the chat, there's a chat in this webinar. As I go throughout this, I would encourage you to ask questions. I will stop, I will answer them, and we'll talk about them as we go. So I would welcome your questions, would love them in the chat. Please paste them in there as we're going, and I'd be happy to address them as we dive into it. So with that being said, let's jump into the first topic. What we're dubbing the payment black hole, which is why payments can disappear between transaction and deposit. And when we think about business in general, good businesses require seamless payments. I think when I was managing a team of people, when I was in my controller role and we were responsible for billing, collections, and reporting, a lot of times you think, hey, we closed the deal, closed one in Salesforce or HubSpot. Maybe you're running that not through a CRM. But it's passed over to finance. Finance sends the invoice and customer pays. Bada bing, bada boom, we're done. It is surprisingly more complex than that. And generally, when that process does not work seamlessly, that's when things get complicated. And it's not just one thing that can break throughout that process. It's a whole host of things. And if any of you have experienced this, or you're saying, wait a second, the invoice was paid last month, but I'm not able to find that in my deposit, maybe things aren't matching up, it can relate to any of the many things on this slide right here. So it could be that the customer actually tried to pay you and the payment just didn't go through. And that can be for a variety of reasons, such as, maybe their credit card is expired. Maybe you had them on auto pay and that card expired. And now you have to get the new card if it's not on, if you don't have card updater running. Maybe they have an issue with their bank. Maybe a customer, there's some compliance issue or something like that, or it's a new region currency, or maybe they accidentally entered the wrong bank account number. I'm not saying I've ever done that. I won't admit to it. But if somebody who has ever tried to pay an invoice and they enter the wrong bank account number, if it's a wire, that can be very hard to get that money back. The other thing that can happen too is customer gets frustrated with you and they go around you to get their money back through a chargeback, which if you accept card payments, it's part of the game. Visa, MasterCard, Amex, they all make it, they design these systems to be consumer facing and friendly. And so they can actually go around you, put a chargeback, get their money back, and then all of a sudden you enter into a dispute process. All that to be said, seamless payments are not easy. And I think us folks as finance professionals, people who are helping our businesses grow, we spend a lot of energy trying to design a really seamless process where our sales team gets a quote, they ultimately get a signed contract, then that passes over to finance where we do the invoice payment, and then ultimately reconciling that to the deposit. But if any of those things go wrong in the previous screen, like we were just talking about, it is really hard to have a workflow that goes the other way, where you find the issue, where you detect, hey, something's off in my bank account system. And then you have to trace it back to, well, how does that impact the payment? Then do I need to go recollect, do I have to go collect payment again on the invoice? If the customer is disputing that, does it ultimately lead to a change in the overall contract? And then is that going to impact my sales rep's commission? If you've spent all the energy thinking about a flow one way, but not the flow going the other way, which is something that does happen, it's not an anomaly, it can be very disruptive. And you can spend, hours on a single invoice and tracing that down. And as you get to scale and you have much more volume, that can be a very, very confusing process that can compound really quickly. And a circumstance I was in personally was, we had over 3,000 customers, most of them on monthly invoicing. And if you think, just the process of managing that top workflow above, how much time how complicated that can be across, 3,000 invoices a month. And then all of a sudden you have to look for a needle in a haystack because something on the bottom row there went wrong. It can really compound. And so, the hope within this whole thing is if you get this right, and your payments are working well with your billing, it fuels your business engine. And then you can really do some fun things, which, your CFOs, your investors, your executives, that's really what they want to be able to do is plan for the future. And the only way you can really plan for the future is if you have, you can reliably predict when you're going to actually get paid from your customers. And so let's just go into a little bit more about, our second agenda point here, where it's, what can happen if you have failed payment? How could that lead to failed business? And some of the things that, can really weigh on, just the ability to have a seamless thing here. And fun fact, before we dive into this, a separate webinar I'd done a few years ago, we actually looked at Maxio to say, hey, what are the top reasons that companies, go belly up? And, besides the number one reason is ultimately you build a product that nobody wants, but we're going to assume that everybody on this, this webinar has ultimately, you've got product market fit. That's not a problem, but that could be a big problem if you're an early stage business and you're trying to find product market fit. Number one reason underneath that is cash flow issues. And if you're on the finance team, that, if you are on a finance team, how thin that cash margin can be. If we think back to, whenever Silicon Valley Bank had a bunch of those issues a few years ago, all the startups were, all the people who were using that were freaking out because they realized, oh my goodness, if my cash flow is disrupted and I can't get into my bank, we're going to miss payroll in 2 weeks from now, because it very much is like cash in, cash out. It's very seamless. And if you have a slight disruption, you could be like a $50, $100 million business, but many times you're pumping that cash flow back into the business, out to your employees. And a single disruption can really, it can put you in a very terrible situation very quickly. So we're going to dive into a few things here about how those disruptions to the cash flow can impact, just a very critical lifeline to the business. So I've dubbed these the 4 horsemen preventing successful payment collection. But if we think about, that final mile, you have a contract, you sent the invoice, and the customer's going to make a payment. How do we get that payment to our bank account? Well, there are 4 things that can go wrong, between the final mile there. And that would be, what I would dub authorization, expiration, and, the rejects, such as, a bank reject, an ACH reject, or a chargeback. And so for the first one, authorization for a card. You think about somebody goes to your little payment window and they go to put in their card, and then you're like, great, it's going to go through. Well, that isn't always the case. With any sort of payment gateway or anybody that you're plugging into, there's actually a whole compliance and risk process that goes into that, where it's saying, is Visa, is MasterCard, are they going to let this transaction happen? And there's a whole host of reasons why it can't why it might not happen. But if it doesn't happen, ultimately you fail, right? It's not going to go to the bank account because that credit card's not valid. Or maybe, you had a card on file and it expired. Same thing. You don't get there. And then once we get to the final two things, bank reject or chargeback, this is where the customer is starting to take matters into their own hands, and they're going, I'm going to prevent you from getting to my bank account because I'm upset for some reason. Maybe it's a service issue. Maybe they're trying to get out of the contract early, whatever it is. All these roads ultimately lead to a collections issue. And if you've ever had to collect payment from a customer, you know that, there's a little bit of an art for it. And I had, rewind again. I had a whole team who was specialized in getting customers to pay these invoices. And sometimes, the collections team could handle that. Sometimes we had to pull in the sales rep. Sometimes we had to pull in the account manager, whoever it was. But collections issue, ultimately, if we think about it compounding at scale, it really can get out of control really quickly. And ultimately, what you need to think about when you're designing payment systems is, how can I make sure that I have processes to identify these early and then fix them very quickly? And the final two in particular, if you let those get out of control, they can actually lead to compliance issues. And so if you have customers, one of the things that maybe people don't talk about very often because we're so busy running the business and sending invoices and doing, collecting payment from our customers. If your customers all of a sudden start putting up barriers and they say, I'm putting a stop payment on my bank account, or I'm going to contest your charge via the chargeback process, those are like little analytics that you've got to remember. When payments are taking place, you're actually plugging into a much broader network. And if you start having ratios that it's a very tight ratio, the best practice here is you want to have a ratio under, we think about the quantity of successful payments that go through in a given month versus the quantity that maybe get protested by customers. You want that ratio under 0.5%. Not much room for error there. If you stay above that for a prolonged period of time, you'll eventually get on certain watch lists, whether it be for their regulatory bodies, Notch's, the bank one in the US, and then for chargeback, it really is kind of on a card by card brand basis. But if you stay above that and your customers, your payers start to protest that, to a certain scale, it can lead to fines, and the fines are not trivial, anywhere between $10,000 to $100,000 per occurrence. So it's one of those things where you really have to make sure your ducks are in a row, because at the end of the day, if you don't have good insight into these four areas, not only is it going to impact your cash flow, but then it will also impact how does this weigh on my ARR reporting or something like that. Now let's maybe dive into how can we actually start, fixing some of these issues through having connected processes, or, the costs associated with not having these things dealt with. Let's dive into disconnected processes here. So the real cost, and how this can weigh on your bottom line. And we're going to dive into some of those four, when we think about the slide before, they're really kind of three areas that I like to touch on here. One would be collections, how much does that cost you? Compliance, and then ultimately reporting risk. So when we think about collections, let's just think about, one of those four horsemen took place. What's the actual impact to your bottom line? At the end of the day, it's going to boil down to your efficiency. When I think back to when I was managing this myself, I had 2 full-time people, and their whole job was to, collect payment from customers. And that can be anywhere from a 5 to a 6-figure type, weight on the overall business, simply because we had to manually follow up and start calling customers, sending emails, whatever it might be. That can really weigh on your business. And so you may need to hire anywhere between, 1 to 3 employees to manage that. That's pretty expensive when you think about, well, maybe we wouldn't need to hire anybody if we had, or maybe we just make our team more efficient and give them better insight so they can be more actionable for a fraction of that cost. When we think about compliance risk, like I was saying, if you start getting above these ratios and stuff like that, what can happen is you can, very quickly get into, like a 6-figure fine zone, or ultimately, don't mean to be gruesome here, but the skull and crossbones is, if it's bad enough for so long, you'll get shut off from being able to use those networks. And if you're shut off from the ability to, say, collect card payment on Visa or MasterCard or whatever it might be, or if you can't collect bank payment, and we think about, okay, you might have a 2-week window, cash in, cash out. to make sure that you can meet payroll, that can, put the business in a very difficult position. And I think, the final one to think about here is, one thing that I had to manage previously in all of this is just how do I report, when we think about quote to contract to invoice to payment to deposit, but that final mile, something's wrong, and ultimately what the contract amount is not going to equal the amount of cash that we collect. That ultimately is going to return in the form of something that I need to update and disclose in my reporting. Maybe that's I've got to increase my bad debt, my bad debt percentage. But for whatever reason, if your contracts are not going to ultimately equal the amount that goes to your bank account, you've got to think about how that impacts, your ARR, your revenue reporting, whatever it is. Because if you ultimately can't efficiently identify that and then correctly report on that, what that ultimately leads to is they find somebody who can do that. Because if you can't do that, ultimately what it can do is it can impact, if your numbers are not reliable, it can impact the overall valuation for the company. And many times there's like zero tolerance for getting those numbers wrong. So it's a really critical thing to get right. But let's jump into a little bit about, what can actually happen whenever this thing is working really well. And this gets into some of the solutions, a little bit of a teaser here to the solution. But ultimately, if you have these things buttoned up in a row, a good system will do something like reconciling this for you automatically, where you say have multiple payments coming in, on a given day. Ultimately, those equal to a single, deposit record, like $600. And then you'll post that, that'll go from your system such as Maxio to, your GL or ERP, whichever you're using. And then ultimately there's an automated check that goes through, hey, what's coming through my bank feed? And does that equal the deposit record that got created from the system? If it does, there's no issue. The four horsemen aren't a thing. You don't have to call anybody. All of this has been automatically done for you. And that ultimately gets into a little bit of the solution that we want to talk about here today. And we're ultimately going to get to a demo portion of this where I show you a little bit of like, what does it look like in Maxio to use Maxio Payments, and what are some of the features that we've designed to make this whole process a little bit easier. But really what we've done with Maxio Payments is that we've thought about those two workflows where you go from, quote to deposit, and then from deposit back to quote, whatever, wherever you go, both forwards and backwards within that. And really what we've done with Maxio Payments is that we wanted to add, when we say better features, we're basically talking, more integrated features. Billing and payments are inherently linked together. You can't have a good system if they're not tightly coupled together. And then ultimately, it's really helpful whenever you're trying to resolve a billing and payments issue if you're dealing with the same support team. That's what we have. That's one of the reasons why we've built our own payment solution here at Maxio. Is that we have, you have one support team to go to that can look into your billing and your payments issue. We have specialists within each team, but ultimately it's a Maxio support team. Then we also have very transparent pricing, which, all of our customers get interchange plus pricing with Maxio Payments, which I'm happy to dive into, ultimately in a separate session here. Some of the things that we've designed here with Maxio Payments is when we think about, the different pieces within those workflows, whether it be like, what are the types of payments that, can you accept card payments, bank payments? Do we do things like account update or deposit syncing? These are all things that have been purpose built into the Maxio payment offering today. And we do have really great gateway partners as well, third-party solutions as well, which you can see on maxio.com. And many of them do have some of these features here, but ultimately when we think about which workflow has the most robust integration into kind of how we do billing and payments together, we've designed that experience uniquely for Maxio Payments altogether. And some of what that boils down to is, we've listened very closely to a lot of the pain points of our customers and saying, what information do you need to ultimately run your processes better? And it could be something, as simple as, hey, one of my payments didn't go through. Why didn't it go through? And can you just put that on a single screen for me? And that's what we've talked about here. We'll show you in the application here in just a minute that having simple things such as like a link to the transaction ID that came from the Maxio billing system, ultimately down to, why did this payment reject? Well, ultimately, the person who tried to pay maxed out their credit card. Maybe you want to just try payment again in 5 days or 10 days, or now you have a reason to go back to the customer with a very, you have the explanation, right at your fingertips. You can go back and you can say, hey, you tried to pay it. Can you use a different card or something like that? Or you can automate your dunning process accordingly to that. These are some of the things that we've designed in the Maxio payment system that's slightly unique relative to what you might get on some of our third-party gateway partners today. So with that being said, it's about time that I cut over to showing you a little bit under the hood. What does the experience look like, and how is Maxio Payments integrated to ultimately how we do billing here at Maxio? Quick reminder, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm happy to try and demo those while we're live here. If I can't do that, I'll follow up with you separately because I will be operating out of a sandbox here. So let's cut over to our Maxio payment experience here. So I am logged into, this looks this exact same as production. But what we've designed here at Maxio Payments is ultimately a screen that, it has two-way links back and forth to our billing system. So if you're logged into Maxio Payments, the first place you'll go is a list of all the payment transactions here. And one of the things that we tried to do uniquely with Maxio Payments is just make it simple and easy. And so on this list here, you can very quickly filter for the type of payment. What's the actual network that it's going through? Is it a UK Bax? Is it Visa, MasterCard? You can filter that easily. Do you need to look into payments versus tokenizations versus refunds, et cetera? We can show you different statuses. If it's an accepted payment, failed payment, whether it's in the chargeback status, et cetera. We can filter on amounts, currencies, settlement currencies. And then one thing that I always find really helpful, let's just say that we do have an issue with payments failing or rejects happening. We can actually filter based on the specific reject reason. So let's just say that we have an issue where there's a fraud. One of the when I say fraud, I mean issuer suspected fraud here. In that Visa has actually flagged, hey, this card being used has been flagged on our network as a fraudulent, a potential risk for fraud. That could be something that maybe you need to intervene on with your customer, or maybe somebody's trying to take advantage of your platform. We surface all of this in the app for you. I do see a question in the chat here where it's, how does this integrate with contracts? And that's a perfect question because that's the next part that I wanted to dive into here. So let's go into a transaction here. And what we'll show you is, when I click into a given payment, there are a couple things that we show you. And these hyperlinks are ultimately going to answer your question for how does it integrate with contracts. What we show you at the top is we show you information about who paid this invoice. So we can show you the cardholder name, the payment amount, when it took place, and then how they paid. Ultimately, we don't display the full card number. That would be a PCI issue, but we can show you, hey, it's Visa, and here are the last 4 digits. On the left-hand side here, we show you details about the transaction. And so the details here, this is pulling from the billing system. And if you're a Maxio customer, we have kind of we have billing and invoicing engines, depending on if you're doing usage-based billing or say you have subscription invoicing as well. But ultimately, this information is coming from Maxio. So if I wanted to understand, hey, this payment relates to this transaction, what transaction is it? I can actually click this link and it will take me to the specific record in question. And so I'm going to come back here to the payment. And well, actually, before I do that, I could click back here on the link, or I could just follow this link from, I'm in advanced billing right now. I can actually click this and it'll take me right back into Maxio. So this ultimately, when we think about ease of navigation, two-way links, like maybe I want to start in my payment system, maybe I want to start in the billing system and get into Maxio Payments. We have two-way links back and forth, which make it really easy. And so you can see here, all right, this is some of the details on the transaction. So, maybe I want to see the payment page, but maybe I actually want to go up and I want to understand what customer is this. And that's one thing that we also differentiate here in Maxio Payments. The cardholder is not always the customer. And so we can see in this case, we actually have a different name for the customer. And so that can be really helpful if I'm trying to understand, maybe somebody is using their Maybe they want to get vacation points. I don't know what the size of your subscriptions are, but if it's a small subscription, sometimes people just put it on their, personal card, but ultimately belongs to, it belongs to a different customer. Well, I can actually follow this link and this will take me to the customer record as well. And so we have two-way links that ultimately take you to the respective record from where that invoice originated. So if this originated, right now I'm showing you advanced billing. If this originated on the Maxio platform, this would take you to that respective record as well. So some of you are leveraging advanced billing. Some of you might be using just platform because you don't have complex usage-driven needs. We basically take you exactly to where the source record was there. And then ultimately down the bottom, we can show you details around what was the amount, what was the settlement amount. So let's just say, sometimes these will vary. If you have, say, a customer who pays in British pounds, but then ultimately you're settling to USD because you have a USD bank account, you need to do currency conversion. We support that as well with Maxio Payments. We'll show you the difference there. And then ultimately, your fees and the net amount that goes to your bank account. There's another question in the chat. What does it look like for ACH payments? Exactly the same. So same screen, just instead of credit card here, it would show you, the bank, basically it'd be an ACH payment along with 4. And just to show you that as well, I can actually filter for that. Why don't we go payment method? We'll go direct debit here. And we'll just click into this and you can see here, we've labeled it as direct debit, but same screen, same experience, same links. I could click into the payment record there. I could click into the customer record. Same experience though, ultimately. Let me click into a few more things here, which may be helpful as well. So these are just the payment records. And like we were showing, there's a lot of good insight that you can get whenever you're trying to figure out, filter for, say, rejects or something like that. But chargebacks is a thing that you have to be able to manage efficiently. And so let's go into our disputes tab here. And when we get into our disputes, we can show you, hey, these are open chargebacks where you need to respond to them quickly because there's a limited time. The card brands all have different windows of time where you can respond to a chargeback. But let's just click into one here as an example. But we'll show you immediately, you have roughly a month or 3 months to defend a given chargeback. So let's click into here and we'll show you, hey, for whatever reason, the customer says, hey, you billed them in the incorrect currency. And we'll show you a timeline here of, there's a chargeback that took place. The dispute date was here. And this is how much time you have left to defend it. Ultimately, if you don't respond by August 9th, you're going to lose the chargeback and the customer will get their money back. We give you a place up here where you can actually submit evidence. And then again, if you're trying to figure out what does this relate to, I can actually follow these different links and I can go back to the original transaction where the customer had paid this, but they've since disputed it. And if I want to navigate back to the chargeback, I can actually scroll down to the bottom and this will take me back to that chargeback that we were just looking at there. So ease of navigation, how can I make sure that I can get to my records easily? We also show that same information here as well. Let's go back to disputes really quick. We can also show you, hey, what's the status of any disputes that are pending? You've submitted evidence and they're getting reviewed by the card brands. You can also see the ones that you've won, the ones that you've ultimately lost. And then ultimately, if you want to see all of them in a single list, you can always go to the view all and you can see all of your chargebacks in a given place. But makes it very easy for you to navigate, work, understand, what does this relate to, et cetera. And then the final thing I wanted to get to here is our deposit screen. Like I was showing earlier, deposits, and I'll cut back to the slide here. One of the things, when I took on my first controller role, one of the things I was super excited about was finally I get to do all the exciting things, such as like pulling together analyses and do the forward-looking things so that we can help run the business better. I spent, my first 3 months reconciling bank accounts because this process of saying we got a deposit for $600 and what invoices are associated with that deposit record was so complex and it had just gotten out of control. With deposits, one of the things that we do in Maxio Payments, which is a huge time saver here, is, this whole process of automatically associating payments to the deposit, syncing it to your GL or ERP so that it reconciles to the bank feed, this is a key feature that we offer at Maxio Payments. And so I'll show you that here. But with deposits, what we can actually do is if you click into the detail, and I'm actually going to I'm going to click out of this specific customer, and I'm going to go into my super admin view here to show you a little bit of a different example. But what we can show you here is we can actually show you, hey, there were 4, if I go to the deposit screen here, I can see there were 4 payments associated with this one deposit. Here was the total sales, the total fees, ultimately for a net deposit here. I can see the transaction IDs. I can see the customer name, which doesn't, sometimes it differs than the payer name. I can ultimately see when it booked and then the associated fees on each one of these. And if I ever want to say, something looks off or I want to click into it, I can always just click this link and it'll actually take me straight to that particular record in question. So ultimately, pretty quick ease of use. This right now, once this syncs to the platform, then ultimately you would have a hyperlink here that will also, be able to take you into the platform as well. And then, bada bing, bada boom, that whole process is, reconciled and automated for you. And so, question from Dallas in the chat, will it separate gross funds received, such as revenue, from credit card processing fees? And the answer is yes. What we have set up in our sync settings, ultimately, when you're setting up, say, your connection to QuickBooks or NetSuite or Xero, there's a section within there called "Where do you want to send your fees?" And basically, you can select the appropriate GL account, and then whenever we create those deposit records, we'll automatically say, "Hey, these fees, this $14.32." goes to that expense account I've dubbed, and then ultimately, the net amount goes to the right GL account as well. So we automatically put those fees exactly where they need to go, so that you can have your gross versus your net versus your fees all properly accounted for in the GL. Any other questions while I'm on this screen? Oh, Vicky, this is a good question. So, can you adjust the payment so that fees are paid by the customer? So, this gets into a topic called surcharging. So, surcharging is something that is commonly requested by a lot of folks. And while we're doing that, I'm also, since we're in question mode, I'm happy to jump back into the demo at any point. But while I'm taking questions here, 2 things I want to flag up is, first of all, my email address. If you have any specific questions for me, you can contact me here. Or also Nate Lee, who is account manager who specializes in payments at Maxio. He would also be able to take your questions as well. And then we'll ultimately put a link in the chat to a blog post we did where you can also book time with any specialist here at Maxio if you would like to dive deeper into your specific topic. So we'll put that link in the chat. But going back to your question, thank you, Adine. So if you see the link there from Adine, that will take you to a place where you can actually book time with our team. So can you adjust the payment so that fees are paid by the customer? We do not dynamically do that at Maxio today. And it's something that we've actually looked in across a number of different providers. And it's not something that is always commonly offered. Part of the reason that we don't do that dynamically today, it is one thing that we are looking at adding to our roadmap, is it's highly regulated depending on which state and which country that you're getting into. What we generally see customers do if they want to pass along the fees to their customers is they'll either add a separate line item on the transaction that they send the customers to cover that convenience fee or the payment fee. Or what they'll do is they'll have their customers, one of the things that you can do dynamically is you can choose, do I want to allow my customer to pay via card or via ACH payment, bank payment? And so many times whenever you're trying to avoid, call it those 3% fees, then you'll have them, the number one way to save on payment fees is to have people pay via bank account. And that's commonly what we'll see there. And so Dallas has a question here. We use invoicing payment syncs from Maxio. Does that work here too? And the answer is yes. So payments, excuse me, payments, syncing from Maxio, all of that works as well. Did I answer that question, Dallas? I want to make sure I got that right. And then there's another question from Sujan about how do you help with contract management? And I would want to dive a little bit more deeper into that question to get specifically into the specifics for what you mean about contract management there. But the short answer is yes, contract management is what we do all day, every day at Maxio. I'll pause for a few more seconds here if there are additional questions. And one thing I will try to pull up here, if I can, is an example of how we sync those fees separately to the GL. And Vicky, you have a question. Does this work if you use QuickBooks Enterprise? The short answer is yes. We do have integrations to QuickBooks Enterprise. We find most people these days are shifting to QuickBooks Online. That is like the latest and greatest from QuickBooks, especially as they also roll out Intuit Enterprise services. And we see most customers are on that. But we do, we do sync to both QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online. And let's see if I can pull up. Here we go. All right, we are doing some on the demo, live showing of sync settings here. So we are actually now on Maxio platform. And I wanted to show you a little bit about going back to Dallas's questions about how do you separate gross funds received from credit card processing. These are actually some of the deposit sync settings that we permit in Maxio. And so what we can basically say is, hey, what is the account where you ultimately receive deposits from your bank accounts? In this case is Silicon Valley Bank. And then where do you want to put the fees associated with your credit card or bank account? We give you a place where you can select separately there. And then, if for whatever reason, say you receive a payment from a customer that has not yet been tied to an invoice, that's a real thing that happens. Sometimes a customer pays twice. Where would you put that? And so that can ultimately go to, you can map that to a separate account as well so that you can easily track like, hey, customer paid, but it's not tied to an invoice. Where should that go? So we give you that ability as well. And then I'm taking a look at the questions as well. Yep. Okay. So, Sujan, I totally get your question now. So do we work with contracts for future contract terms and payment schedules? Yes, we do. Ultimately, when you're thinking about taking that, quote to contract to invoice to payment to deposit, many times, you'll get a quote and a contract where that contract says, hey, we're going to bill you, you're paying $12,000 and you're going to pay all up front for an annual contract, or maybe you're going to pay monthly over the term of the contract. And then maybe you'll offer different payment terms, net 15, net 30, net 45, net 60. That is bread and butter what Maxio does all day, every day. And then payments bolts on ultimately to is integrated into that billing experience. But that is what Maxio does all day, every day. So happy to dive into your specific use case in more detail. All right. Well, I really appreciate everybody spending, roughly the last 40 minutes with me here. If you have any questions or things that you would like to dive into in more depth, please follow that link that Dean just pasted in the chat there. And we look forward to following up with you. And I'll put the link in here as well, just as to put it to the top of the chat. But we would love to have a more in-depth conversation with you and appreciate the time that we've spent together here the last 40 minutes. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the next webinar.